Good afternoon and welcome to the debut spotlight. My name is Ellen Comisar and I'm delighted to be joining you today with Banning Lyon, who is the author of this wonderful memoir, The Chair in the Valley, a memoir of trauma, healing, and the outdoors. And as I've said on Twitter, I guarantee you are going to be interested in what Banning has to say and then want to run out and get several copies of his book, to one for yourself and one to give away, several to give away to the people in your life. Before we get started, Banning, I just want to give our typical Mighty Blaze pitch. For those of you who are longtime members of Blaze Nation, welcome back. For those of you who are new, thank you for joining us. A Mighty Blaze is a team of 30 creative professionals who got together at the outset of COVID and decided we needed a way to connect authors to readers and readers to books as the book tours were getting canceled. We've now been here 4+ years and we're going strong and have no intention of going anywhere else but online and into your homes. You can find us all over social media, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and now TikTok. We have a great website, which is www.amightyblaze.com. And if you go there, you can sign up for our newsletter, which comes out bi-weekly, and you'll find out all about our shows upcoming and some past programs that we think will be of interest and other special programs that we're doing. So we hope you will use this as an opportunity to join the Blaze Nation and continue to introduce yourselves to great authors. So I am very happy that I stumbled upon Banning Lyon's book, The Chair in the Valley, at my local library and read it and immediately said we had to get Banning on the show. And I am not alone in thinking wonderful things about this memoir. It is on Booklist's list of best memoirs of 2024. They called it Bracing, Brilliant, and Fury-Inducing, a survival story like no other. Maria Shriver, who is the creator of the Open Field imprint at Penguin Random House, found Banning's book and published it and says it is a testament to the power of found family and the hard-earned resilience that can come over time with love. The book has been called Deep, Dark, and Beautifully Written. It's an aching and engaging memoir of family catastrophe, misuse of mental health care, loss, and redemption. It's been called heartfelt and an urgent demand for higher standards of juvenile mental health care by Kirkus. And Ben Moon, the author of Denali, A Man, a Dog, and the Friendship of a Lifetime, calls this book an unapologetically honest story of survival and overcoming unspeakable trauma. It's unflinching and yet unexpectedly relatable. So we welcome you, Banning, and I'm very excited to talk to you about The Chair in the Valley.
Thanks for having me, Ellen.
You are so welcome. Just a little bit of background about you. I've mentioned a few of the things. The book has been out 6 months and a day, and Banning has been featured in the New York Times and the Washington Post. He currently lives in the San Francisco Bay Area and works as a backpacking guide and outdoor educator. And I am delighted to have you today.
Thrilled to be here. Thank you.
So this book caught my eye in the library primarily because of the visual, gorgeous cover.
Yeah, it's a lovely
and the
book.
title, which I really couldn't quite grasp. Didn't know which chair or which valley. So can you just give us a little bit of a background as to the title and what it's referring to?
So I actually workshopped the book for several years with a local workshop run by an old beat poet named Clive Matson. And I had a working title for the book and I was not crazy about it. And I just sort of put that away in my subconscious because I was just more busy writing the book. It was in the early days of writing it. And I tried to think about, if I could boil down the premise of the book to the two most important things and sort of put them in juxtaposition to each other. My highest point and my lowest point, or what those two things that impacted my life so greatly in a negative way and a positive way.
So just to give some readers the background, because I didn't really divulge too much, can you just give a very quick overview of what the chair is referring to and what the valley is? What was your experience that led you to your life and also to write this beautiful memoir?
So when I was 15, I was locked in a psychiatric hospital run by a corporation that would eventually plead guilty to paying kickbacks and bribes for patients. And while I was in that hospital, I was forced to sit in a chair facing a wall for sometimes upwards of 10, 12, sometimes even more hours a day. And I did that for months. I was on what they called permanent chair and room for months and months and months. And I sat in a chair facing a wall for thousands of hours of my life. And it was horrible. It was torture for me. And especially as a very, very sort of almost hyperkinetic 15-year-old. Then, 30 years later, or 25 years later, here I am, a backpacking guide in Yosemite National Park, and I see this place for the first time as a 39-year-old, Yosemite Valley. And so I really wanted to sort of come up with some juxtaposition of those two things, the two things that impacted my life so greatly, the chair and the valley. And I blurted that out during workshop one day, and somebody turned to me and said, "Oh, I love that title." And I didn't think much of it, but it worked. It wasn't a title that I fell in love with, but it was a title that seemed right to me. And
Well,
people always reacted positively to it, so I stuck with it.
It also helps as you're reading the beginning parts of the book, which are, clearly a traumatic time in your life and they're difficult to read. I mean, regardless of one's own experiences in the mental health world, just this concept, we've all been 14, 15 years old. We've all had arguments with our parents and dark thoughts at school. And all of a sudden you're in this very dark place. And yet the valley, you sort of know something good is coming. The book is going somewhere, and you, the writer, and you, the reader, will both emerge at some point through that part of the story and get to an easier part of life, an easier part of the story, as it were. So this psychiatric hospital, I mean, clearly it was a big scam to get insurance. And it preyed on families and kids who were, oftentimes from broken homes, from single parent families. And your parents had gone through a difficult divorce and were not very communicative with each other at times and living in different states. One of the things I noticed is, obviously, the idea of sitting still facing a wall. I mean, they seemed to suggest to you as a kid that this was therapeutic for you.
They called it chair therapy. The name for it was chair therapy. They called it chair therapy.
Mm-hmm. And clearly you and some of the other characters that you and friends that you had in the hospital were pretty clear that it wasn't therapeutic.
No, it was self-evident to us. It was, I mean, and this is something I still feel strongly about, and I think it's a real problem in the world nowadays, is for some reason we as adults, I'm 53 now, and it's happened to me. I mean, I'm very conscious of the fact that as I've gotten older, my mind begins to sort of ossify, and I become less flexible to new opinions and new things, and I have to constantly check myself and decide, why am I being biased against something? And I think a very common bias amongst adults is that teenagers, they're silly or dumb or that it's just a phase. Well, the 40s are a phase, the 50s are a phase, the 60s are a phase. And so I really still to this day deeply relate to teenagers and the frustration of being a teenager. And that's something that I really wanted to communicate in my book. And I've gotten a lot of letters actually from teenagers, which I love, about my book. And kids are not dumb. And if you ask a 15-year-old to do something like sit in a chair and face a wall, and you tell them that it's good for them, they're not going to believe you. They're not stupid. And so we as kids knew this was not helpful. and that they were simply doing it to get us out of the way, to just
Keep you
sort of
quiet.
basically control us. It was a way to just control us. The hospital was all about control.
But you were also, even though there was, group therapy, et cetera, and limited other kinds of therapy, and I'm using quote marks for those who are going to listen to this as a podcast, because it was very minimal. You were also highly discouraged from A, talking to each other, B, talking to the staff, C, complaining about anything. So as much as you were aware of the situation, you weren't really allowed to push back in any way, it seemed.
No, we had no real control or say over the conditions of our incarceration.
And it wasn't incarceration.
Yeah, it was incarceration, absolutely. And we were not allowed to go outside. We had no real freedom. One of my friends was thrown in bed restraints and tied to a bed for 333 days because he refused to turn over his diary. And
Wow.
so it was this constant struggle between control. And as teenagers, literally your mission statement in life as a teenager is to find that boundary of maximum control. Where can I push boundaries the most? Like that's a healthy teenager. That's exactly what you're supposed to be doing.
Absolutely.
And they would, the staff and doctors of the hospital would constantly push back on that constant. And when I say constant, I mean every few minutes. And so there was this constant struggle between us and them. It really was this us and them situation. But yeah, we had no, we were not allowed to privately communicate. We were not allowed to touch each other. We had no access to telephones or the outside world. Our mail was monitored. We had no real way to advocate for ourselves at all.
And then there was just the pure arbitrariness of the punishments that would ensue for what was deemed an infraction of whatever crazy rule had been established.
Yeah, kids were thrown in restraints for chewing gum. I mean,
Wow.
I knew people that spent weeks in bed restraints because they chewed gum when they were told to not chew gum. And that's where it was clearly to us not therapeutic. I mean, there were people in bed restraints for months and months and months, to the point where their limbs would atrophy. They would get bed sores. They would have to wrap towels inside the restraints because their bed sores would start weeping.
Mm.
It was clearly it was not designed to make us better. And as a 15 and then 16-year-old, I turned 16 in the hospital. This was evident to me within my first few weeks. And so I sort of dissociated and turned this hospital into this sort of maze. I became a rat, and I was in a maze, and I had to find my way out of the maze. And the way I figured that I would most successfully navigate the maze was through compliance. I just was constantly, it irritated them, but I never saw somebody thrown in restraints for being too compliant. And so I just decided to follow the path of least resistance, and
Saved you.
yeah, it's as best it could. I wound up spending 353 days in the hospital, and then I was sent to a halfway house for 6 months.
Now, what struck me, I mean, regardless of your parents' ability and emotional connection, and whether they were designed to be parents at the age they became parents, that there were a lot of people that sort of stepped away and accepted what was going on there, including the therapist who your mother first took you to, Sam. In retrospect, and throughout the book, he came and visited you, he talked to you. Was there any opportunities? I mean, was he sort of wrapped up in this? Was he somebody who had been bought as well as the doctors and people who worked?
I will never have an answer to that.
Okay.
I don't know if he was in on it. I ultimately decided, sort of in my 15-year-old mind, and sort of gaming my way through the hospital, I began sort of telling him things that I wouldn't share with the hospital staff as sort of a test, like dipping my toes in the pool. I would
Mhm.
communicate things to him about, for example, how frustrated I was about being in the hospital, or how much I didn't like it, or how much I missed being outside. Things I couldn't normally say to the staff and doctors of the hospital, I would share with him. And there was no negative repercussion for that. And so I began to realize that he was sort of this little separate world. And so I began to see him in many ways as sort of a confidant. And I never saw a negative result of me sharing things with him. And so I continued to do that throughout my stay. And he seemed to hold those, the things that I shared with him very gently. He didn't seem to ever use them against me. He didn't seem to do the sort of painful things that the staff and doctors of the hospital did. So I always held him in gratitude after I left the
Mhm.
hospital, because he was this one sort of place of peace for me. And my hour with him that I would have once or twice a week was a time that I ultimately kind of came to look forward to, because I could sit on my bed, and I didn't have to stare at the wall. I could talk to somebody who wasn't mean, or it felt like kind of a human connection, which I didn't really have any of in the hospital.
Talking to anybody on staff was always a risk because they could
Correct.
just find a reason
Yeah.
to
As
punish you.
long as they had anybody who had any direct ties to the hospital was unsafe, regardless
Mhm.
of how much you like them. And there were people from the hospital, staff members, a few that I liked, but because they were in on it, you had to be very, very cautious about the things that you shared with them, and what you said and how you said it. And yeah, that was a whole different world that you had to treat very with a different set of rules.
So when you uh, came out of the hospital, uh, a reporter at the Dallas Morning News, Jonathan Eig, who has, as many of our viewers know, went on to a great career as a biographer. He won the Pulitzer Prize for King just last year. He was reporting the story. He came to meet you when you were about 20. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was either 20 or 21 when I first met
Mhm.
Jonathan. Yeah.
So he sort of came upon the story or reported out the story of these hospitals and this national company uh, that was doing this. And what was your relationship with Jonathan has lasted the rest of your life and continues now. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like when you finally both met him and met the lawyers who took on the case and started working with you? You were young, you were 20, you were not a grown up, you'd finished high school, but you were just sort of out there in the world having had this past history that none of your high school friends had had. What was it like to meet Jonathan, and what kind of influence has he been for you?
So let me unpack a few of those things.
Okay,
Firstly, let me
please.
apologize for coughing. I'm still
No.
getting over a cold here. Um, I had been out of the hospital, I think, if I recall correctly, about 5 years when
Mm-hmm.
I discovered that the hospital was being sued for insurance fraud. Um, by that time, I was a disaster. When I left the hospital, I immediately recognized that I did not function correctly anymore, that the sort of tolerance for society that I used to have was almost non-existent. I became uh, sort of um, the whole world and its activity, and people talking whatever they wanted and arguing, like going to a public high school, for example, um, just left me constantly um, overstimulated, and it would just fill my brain with noise, and it made me very angry and irritable. A lot of the violence and rage and other things that I'd witnessed in the hospital sort of felt like I felt as if they had sort of infected me. I began to have
Mm-hmm.
flashbacks. I didn't know it at the time, but I was suffering from pretty serious PTSD. And so I I recognized pretty early on that I was not like my peers anymore. And I began to have to like hide or camouflage my identity. And when you're like that, when you're a trauma survivor, you to survive sort of in the real world, you tend to sort of split your personality. You have this facade that you present to the real world to go to work and go grocery shopping, but you have this inward world that is yours and usually yours alone. You might share it with one or two people, but um, with that comes a lot like shame and humiliation and anger and fear. And that's the world, that's the life I was living for 4 or 5 years after the hospital. Then I discovered this lawsuit. I joined this lawsuit. And then I met Jonathan Ike. And so Jonathan was one of the first journalists that I spoke to during the lawsuit. And I liked him immediately. He was not much older than me. And he was very affable, very kind. He would listen to me and intentionally listen, and not something I'd ever really experienced. The way a journalist listens to you, especially when you're 20, if you had lived the life that I had lived, was really unique. To have somebody be silent and watch you and listen to you and then repeat back some of the things that you say to validate that they had heard you was a really unique and sort of empowering experience. It felt like a very unique connection. And because of that, I really liked Jonathan almost immediately. Jonathan and my attorney, whose name was Robert, they were concerned. They seemed to be more, they would have discussions amongst themselves about things like legislation and politics and what created this problem. And none of that stuff really concerned me. I didn't really care at that time about the bigger picture. All I cared about was the pain I had suffered and my friends in the hospital had suffered. And so the lawsuit for me was a very personal thing. And Jonathan seemed to really care about that. And that meant a lot to me. And I lost touch with Jonathan for decades after
Oh, I
that.
didn't
And
know that.
it wasn't until I began writing my book that I decided I actually remembered him. I was like, oh yeah, that Jonathan I guy, he was so cool. Um, and this was like 7 years ago, probably. And I thought, oh, he's probably some podunk reporter who's probably still working in the Dallas Morning News, plugging away in his cubicle. And lo and behold, I Google him, and he's this world famous author who's or books are just so highly regarded. And I was like, oh my God, he's never going to remember me. I'll reach out to him and see if he'll, if I can interview him, because I wanted to see if I could jar loose some memories, because I was basically investigating my own life to try to jar loose some memories. And I got a hold of him, and of course he was like, of course I remember you, give me a call. And from that day forward, when I told him I was writing a book, he sort of took me under his wing and became this mentor to me, and opened a lot of doors for me. He was immensely helpful and very kind. And I think above all, he was a cheerleader. He was somebody who really seemed to believe in me, and not just somebody who believed in me, but a really successful, talented, skilled author who believed in me.
That's
And
got to
that
be
meant a lot.
very empowering.
That meant a lot to me. It was really empowering. And so his belief in me carried me through this process. There were a lot of times that I almost quit. And sometimes I would even reach out to him, and he's like, keep going, man, keep going. You can do it.
So you were already in the process of planning to write, thinking about a book before you reached out to him and got his help and advice and encouragement. What led you? What was that initial spark that said, there's a story that I'm uniquely qualified to tell, and that I'm going to put myself through the pain and agony that any writer goes through to write, but also the special pain and agony that will be yours uniquely because of the painful, agonizing experiences that you're going to be writing about and
So
revisiting.
I throughout my life, more times than I can count, I had been told by people, whether it was girlfriends or friends or people I just met in passing, You should write a book. You should write a book. Um, and there were a few of those people that really made deeper impacts than others. One of the things that I edited out of my book in some of the early drafts was that I worked as a sailor for a while, and um, I worked as a day sailor in Martha's Vineyard, working on a 42-foot wooden schooner. And one of the people that we took day sailing was, if I recall correctly, an editor for the Boston Globe, and she was a really, really wonderful, very articulate, really nice woman. And we got to speaking, and by this time I would sometimes share bits of my story with people, because people would get on the boat and be like, how do you get this job? This is such an incredible job. And I might tell them a little bit about how, I retired when I was young because I've been in this lawsuit, and then my life is just this Swiss cheese of rabbit holes that people just dive down. And so I told her a little more than I usually tell your average person, and we're getting off the boat at the dock at the end of the day after 4 hours of sailing, and she looked at me straight in the eye and she said, you really need to write a book. It really could help people. And that was, I think, in 2010. And that really made a very deep impact on me, and along with some of the others. And so, but an event that takes place at the end of the book, which I won't spoil for anybody, it's really the last chapter of the book. I meet somebody who's a client on a backpacking trip that I was guiding. And I walked away from that trip feeling as if I had a moral obligation to write the book, that I was doing myself in the world and a lot of other people a disservice by not sharing my story. And not because my life is a product of my own hard work. I mean, I'm learning to acknowledge and give myself credit for the hard work that I've done. That's something I even talk about in the book. But to be fully honest, my life is largely a product of just good and bad luck and serendipity and things just simply falling into my lap. It's not through any hard work of my own that all these incredible, bizarre, painful things that have happened to me. And so because of that, I feel in many ways that my life is a gift, and that if I really wanted to truly honor that gift, that the best thing I can do is share it with other people. And so I felt, after meeting this gentleman on this class, that I very truly had a moral obligation to write my book, and that by not doing so, I was sort of failing at some very important task.
If you're just joining us, the book is The Chair in the Valley by Banning Lyon, a marvelous book that he had to write, and you, my viewers, have to read. It's an incredible story. I read it in June when it first came out. I reread it last night, the night before, and loved it just as much the second time through. It will stay with you. One of the things that I think makes your book so relatable is that there's a lot of discussion about finding your own family or having a family find you. And I was reminded this morning as I was preparing, the Mr. Rogers saying, whenever you're a kid and something's going wrong, look for the helpers.
Yeah.
And in your case, you had people who looked like helpers who were definitely not the helpers.
Yeah.
But you also had people who became helpers. In particular, the lawyer, Robert, and his family. And they both adopted you into their world as a member of their family, very unofficially, and ultimately officially adopted you.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about needing a father figure and how having that father figure, both as, your lawyer, but also ultimately as your father, Pop, how that changed your life?
Firstly, I want to say I love that you use that sort of Mr. Rogers metaphor. That A, I grew up watching Mr. Rogers.
Didn't we all?
And I remember that episode. And B, that really truly is so important, that even we as adults need to look for the people who are going to elevate us, who are going to support us and have our back. And so for me, that idea was a cornerstone of how I found some of these really wonderful people in my life, and I really wanted to honor those people in my book. One of my editors, she said one day that my book is a love letter to those people. And it's so true. That is so true. Thank you, Isabel, for saying that, because that really is what my book embodies for me is in many ways, it is just sort of a thank you letter to the people, to the helpers that have supported me. It could be, in many ways in the book, it's Robert, it's my backpacking mentor, Sandy. It's Don Blair, who's Donnie and Zach's father. There are a lot of people in my life who took me under their wing and really gave me a chance. And without those people, I wouldn't even be here today. So Robert was my attorney. Ultimately, he and his family adopted me. It was a very, very hard decision for me to accept that adoption. I initially did not want to. I think one of the reasons I would like to see my book sort of get more exposure or be talked about more is because I feel really strongly about men's mental health. And my book, I think in many ways, is a really deep look into men's mental health. And one of the things in my book that I try to never sort of pedantically discuss that topic. I just want to sort of illustrate it and let people into my world and let people sort of live through that. But the decision-making process of me eventually learning to accept a father figure in my life. I knew that I think I knew that I needed one, but it was very hard for me to accept that because that in many ways meant that I needed someone. And as a man, that's a weakness. We're sort of culturally trained to do things on our own. It's the old joke, like guys don't ask for directions. And so it was really in many ways hard for me as a young man to accept the fact that I really could use a dad and that I needed a family. And because those were all things that by that time I viewed very much as a negative. The word family for me has kind of always been a bad word. Dad was always something, an idea that made me sad because my estrangement with my birth father. And so it was a very painful and difficult decision for me to accept that family. And it took years for me to accept the fact that that was not a weakness, that it wasn't a failure for me to acknowledge the fact that I needed people. And still to this day, when I make that statement that I need people, I feel a sense of shame. There is this little inner monologue that I have that I may always have that, and I don't know where it comes from. I think part of it's cultural. I think part of it is just built into my life personally. But there is this shame in admitting that I need people because I've spent so much of my life trying to make it on my own that the admission of needing other people has been very hard for me. And ultimately, that's kind of what family is about. But my book really is about chosen family and learning to accept those people into your life. And anybody who needs chosen family, I think, is going to feel very much like I did. Like it's hard to accept the fact that we need to acknowledge that we need others.
I think there was also just in reading it the sense that, your own parents did a lot of things in terms of abandoning you, not being present for you, clearly not recognizing what you needed. I know you've written a little bit about, some things about helping parents understand their teenagers and not going overboard in their analysis of what their teenager is going through and looking at them as a real person. But so you had this, your family of origin story, unfortunately, had a lot of abandonment and a lot of instances of distrust, both you're not trusting them not believing you. So that sense of, could you then find a way to trust that Robert and his wife were going to, that this was a real thing. They weren't just going to, adopt you and let you go again. So I think there was also an element of fear that seemed to permeate that whole section of the book.
Absolutely. And I didn't view it necessarily as a product of their being malicious. I didn't view them as malicious people who were out to sort of pick me up and then drop me. I viewed family as sort of an impermanent thing, something that, because as a young kid, I learned that family was not permanent. And I carried that sort of core identity with me throughout my life. And so I I grew up into my 20s and 30s sort of believing that family was not permanent and that I couldn't fully trust them, not because they were bad people, but because that's just what people do. They just drift apart. And so it took me a long time to fully trust them. And then, ultimately, without giving too much of my book away, that family began to fragment, and my rebuilding another relationship with them again was an even more difficult process, because I had not only lost one family, but now two, and through a very similar process as my initial family.
So I want to move toward the healing side of things. The two things that I think come across clearly: the Yosemite Valley, being outside in nature, reconnecting with what you like to do as a kid, was certainly very powerful in terms of healing you from what had been a very broken person who then went through post-hospital difficulties. I won't get into some of the details, but it wasn't a smooth sail after that, so to speak. But it was also that you did a lot of work with therapists, and you went and was it hard for you? So the nature part, I think, was a natural part of the pun, opportunity to go out and be in awe of nature and reconnect in a quiet, but it's calming, it's beautiful, it's peaceful, it's reinvigorating. But to go back to a therapeutic model, which, having seen, what really horrific therapy looks like, is that also part of the men's mental health stuff? How much of that is you being a strong guy and figuring out, I better get this, or being pushed that direction?
Absolutely. I think the therapy part was, I wouldn't say just men's mental health. I think it's mental health in general. I definitely do think that men probably are less inclined to seek out therapy than women probably are. Again, going back to the guys don't ask for directions metaphor. But yes, going out and being in nature for me is it's almost in my blood. I grew up doing it. It's very natural to me. It's my happy place. So guiding the therapy, the sort of nature therapy, that without having a better word at the moment, was something that I just sort of fell into because that's just my nature. Going and choosing to reapproach therapy for me was very hard, and it's still hard. I've seen my therapist for 13 years now. For 13 years I've seen this woman, and there are still days that I'm like, I don't want to be here. I tell her that, but the sort of immense fear and panic that I felt in the first few years of seeing her no longer really exists for me through practice and through her compassion and her really holding and honoring what I've been through in my life. And yeah, I really wanted to make sure to get back to that in the book and discuss that openly about, because Robert, for years, he would always say to me, like, what you experienced in the hospital wasn't therapy, that was abuse. And you need to go and discover what therapy truly is. And I never had any intention of going back to therapy. To me, therapy it's a bad word. It's dumb. It's weak. It's all sorts of things. And, I have a lot of friends from the hospital who still to this day tell me, like, I will never go back to see it. I will never see another therapist. And so
they don't trust the process, or they somehow are just
no. Why would we? Like, it is what caused the primary wound in our lives, and so, and I don't blame them. And still to this day, I sometimes question, like, why do I give it another chance? Pardon me, but I have seen the product of what therapy has done for me. And it's not fun. Therapy is not fun. It's not. And that was something else in the writing and editing of the book that I really wanted to make sure I communicated, because I think a lot of books that talk about therapy have this sort of saccharine kind of Hollywood attitude about it. And I mean, the reality is therapy sucks. It's like,
It's hard work.
yeah, it's hard work. And so I really wanted to communicate that in the book, that it's not something I necessarily enjoy, but it is something that I see the benefit of. And the hard work, you have to want the work. You can't just want the product of the work. You have to want to actually do the work itself. And with that attitude, I think therapy will feel a little more natural. But something I tell anybody, regardless of your age, whether you're a teenager or an adult or a parent of a teenager that you want to see go to therapy, is it needs to be somebody you trust. And you have to, it's no different than any other relationship in your life, like dating or marriage or anything else. You have to like the person and feel a connection and feel like that you can trust them. If you don't feel that way about a therapist, run for your life. Go find somebody else, because there are therapists out there that you can trust.
I thought it was interesting as you were talking about therapy. It was sort of like the process of writing a book. You need to do the work. You can't just say, oh, I want the product.
Right.
You've got to suffer through it. And I'm so glad you did, because this is a wonderful book. So are you still doing a lot of guiding in Yosemite and elsewhere? That was what the Valley refers to, going to Yosemite and working as a guide.
My guiding has tapered off a bit. I'm a father now. I'm a husband. I still guide. I still do multi-day trips. I recently did a trip in Point Reyes. So I still guide in Point Reyes as well, both in Yosemite and Point Reyes. I do more instructing, like day instructing, where I take people out for 8 or 10 hours and teach like Map and Compass or something else. But yes, I still am a backpacking guide. I still work for REI. I will do that as long as they'll let me. I still love what I do, and I probably always will. Yeah.
So I just wanted to share, there's one part of the book that I remember struck me the first time, and it stood out again, even though I had not highlighted it. It's after you're going with Sandy, who takes you under wing and hires you to be a guide with her. And you're in Yosemite, and you hadn't seen Half Dome, and you were sort of disappointed that you were sort of far away and you weren't catching glimpses. And then there's this line. I'm just going to read it because I didn't ask you to, but I will do it for you. Just as we left the woods, Sandy tapped the brakes and said something.
Oh, yeah.
It was difficult to hear her over the wind, so I pulled my head inside the car when I saw her pointing at the windshield. A colossal wall of granite, towering and monstrous, obscured the sky. It loomed thousands of feet over the meadow, its craggy face streaked by millions of years of rain and snow. I stared at the wall, aware of nothing else, wondering if it was something so divine that I should close my eyes. And that, for me, this moment that you went from a very dark staring at a wall and to this magnificent Half Dome. For anyone who's not been to Yosemite, go find Banning and he'll take you for a hike. Can you talk about that? I mean, was that something that in that moment struck you like, oh my God, here's another wall? Or as you wrote that?
I'm so grateful that you read that paragraph, or just half of it, because I spent months working on just that paragraph. I would go back to that paragraph over and over and over and over and over. I don't think there's any other text in the book that I reworked more than that paragraph.
Interestingly.
That moment is one of the most important moments of my life, and I will never forget it. And still to this day, when I go to Yosemite, whether it's with my wife, and my wife reacts the same way, because what I'm seeing in that moment is El Capitan, and it's west face.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was Half Dome.
West face. No, that's the west face of El Capitan. We see Half Dome earlier as we're driving down into the valley.
Okay.
But that thing that we're seeing is the west face of El Capitan. And, whether I'm driving there now for work or with my wife, whenever I see El Cap, I either laugh or cry. And because it's something that is so, I've seen a lot of the world, and I've been to the Colosseum in Rome. I've been to Tiananmen Square. I've seen other historical landmarks. And when you see them, it's like, okay, that looks just like a picture. When you go to Yosemite, it looks nothing like the pictures because the scale of the place is impossible to communicate in a photograph. Yosemite Valley is a mile wide and a mile deep, so it's just as deep as it is wide. And so El Cap is 3.5 Empire State Buildings tall.
Mhm.
And it's in our urban minds, something that large is just, especially a natural feature, is just dumbfounding. And so
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
really wanted to sort of in words communicate what it's like to see that thing for the first time. And I remember that moment so vividly, like so many other moments in my life. And I wasn't conscious of it. Ironic, the sort of irony of it being a wall and me having also stared at a wall, but I was aware at that moment, and I write further in that paragraph about this fact that that thing had always been there, that it had sort of been waiting for me, and there was some real beauty and peace in knowing that these beautiful places exist even when we aren't there with them. That they are sort of distant relatives that we share time and space with, even if we can't see them right then, that they are there with us. And in Yosemite Valley, I live 3.5 hours away from the valley right now. And knowing, that I can sort of close my eyes and think that El Cap is there right now, and it brings me a lot of peace. And so in that moment, I felt such a sense of gratitude that Sandy had taken me to this incredible place that had always been there, even when I was in the hospital, even after Jennifer died, even after all these things that had happened to me in my life. That place had always been sort of waiting for me.
It's a beautiful moment in the book. I understand we have some questions for Banning. Have you spoken with a doctor once since you were an adult?
No, I have not. I have not spoken.
Not as a patient, but to talk about the hospital.
No, I have not spoken to my doctor from the hospital since I was in the hospital.
There's almost a you're very gentle with them. Not, I mean, we know their names or their pseudonyms as they are in the book.
Yeah.
And we certainly have strong feelings for the Luther character. Nobody's going to like him, but you don't really come out, guns a-blazing at them at the end. There's a lot of forgiveness in you. A lot of.
And this is something there's actually another really important paragraph in the book about forgiveness. And because I think, again, there's this sort of saccharine Hollywood misunderstanding around forgiveness. And forgiveness for me, 95% of my experience of forgiveness, and this is something I really want people to walk away from this, if they're listening, to remember this. Forgiveness is not a product of love or compassion. It's often a product of anger and rage and frustration. And so my forgiveness of these people was not for them, it was for me. And it was because I simply wanted to let them go and build a new identity. And I was tired of having them define me. And for me, that's where forgiveness often comes from, is it's not a product of, oh, I love you and I'm going to let you go or anything else. It's more about me wanting to move on and redefine my life without them playing the role in building my identity that they used to.
That's wonderful. Any other questions that we have for Banning? We can talk a little bit about, let's just talk one thing. You told me it took a long time to write up. How did the lawsuit let you feel heard?
Yes, very much so. Robert held me really close during the lawsuit. And his compassion and kindness and his willingness to sort of truly identify with not just me, but other kids in the hospital. What we had gone through was so immensely healing. Absolutely. I think the lawsuit itself was one of the most healing moments of my life, for sure.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. So this has been an incredible conversation. I could keep talking to Banning for hours, but our show doesn't allow me that privilege. We're talking about The Chair in the Valley by Banning Lyon. It's a first memoir. It is an incredible book. It will touch you in ways you can't imagine. So if you haven't, since starting the show, gone out and bought it online, please do so. You can get it at bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores and the Mighty Blaze. Share it with your friends. Share this interview with your friends. You won't be disappointed, I guarantee you. So thank you so much for joining me, Bannon. So if you're making a list and checking it twice, first book on your list, The Chair in the Valley, but you can also join us tonight on The Blaze. There's a pop-up book recommendation show hosted by the Blaze hosts, and we will have some of our favorite books of 2024 and some insights into the books we're starting to read for 2025 that you might want to buy. That's at 8 p.m. Eastern, same place, same channel. And my next debut spotlight is not until January 30th. I will have Bina Kamlani, who was Saul Bellows' longtime editor and has now come out with her own book, The English Problem, which is looking at Indian independence. So 1948 in history, and it's beautifully written, as is Banning's book. So till then, keep reading, and Happy New Year, everyone.